Welcome back everyone, I'm Nick930, and today I want to share with you the complete history of one of my all-time favorite game series, The Last of Us.
It appears that what we initially reported as riots seem to be somehow connected to the nationwide pandemic. We've received reports that victims afflicted with the infection show signs of increased aggression.
Attention. Curfew is now in full effect.
I need something smuggled out of the city.
I reckon it's got something to do with that girl.
It's got everything to do with that little girl.
Joel! Quicker!
If I get in trouble down there, you make every shot count.
I'm leaving tomorrow.
That's enough.
What are you so afraid of?
Do you even realize what your life means?
You can't talk me out of this.
How many times do we need to go over this? Things happen, and we move on.
After all we've been through, everything that I've done, it can't be for nothing.
The Last of Us is a narrative-driven, action-adventure game franchise, developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment. It takes place in a post-apocalyptic United States, where a fungal infection has decimated the world's population, turning those infected with it into bloodthirsty monsters. The story centers primarily around two survivors, a smuggler named Joel and a teenage girl named Ellie, and explores the constantly evolving paternal relationship between them as they travel across the country seeking a cure for all of humanity. Along the way, players will need to make use of a variety of weapons and skills as they contend with both the cannibalistic infected and the increasingly more desperate groups of human survivors. In its relatively short time in the industry, the series has managed to make a significant name for itself, with its two mainline entries earning hundreds of awards thanks to its highly engaging narrative, actor performances, and technical prowess. In doing so, The Last of Us has become a major pillar of PlayStation's first-party lineup of video games, and has even been adapted into a critically acclaimed live-action television series on HBO, an achievement very few video game series, if at all, can claim to share. So, what is it about The Last of Us that has made it so successful? Well, to answer that, let's first take it all the way back to the turn of the century, where the journey in the making of The Last of Us first began. Throughout the course of the late 1990s and early 2000s, the California-based game development studio Naughty Dog had established themselves as a key ingredient to the future of Sony's growing influence in the gaming industry. Early success with the beloved Crash Bandicoot had made the studio a household name for gamers, so much so that the character itself even managed to become something of an unofficial mascot for the PlayStation platform, despite the character technically belonging to Universal at the time. This eventually led to the creation of Naughty Dog's next major franchise, Jak Daxter, that, unlike Crash, was more story-oriented and ambitious from a technical perspective, a direction that would forever cement the studio's core values moving forward. To account for the heightened scope and ambition of these newer projects, Naughty Dog's staff size saw rapid growth during this period, with a litany of talented developers from across the industry joining together, including former Crystal Dynamics developers like Amy Hennig, Evan Wells, and most pertinent to the topic in question, Bruce Straley. Straley began his career in the video game industry soon after acquiring a degree in advertising design and working as a designer on games like X-Men for the Sega Genesis. After a few years working on the Gex series, he joined his co-workers in leaving Crystal Dynamics for Naughty Dog, and worked as a texture artist for the 1999 classic Crash Team Racing, before becoming the artistic lead for many of the Jak and Daxter games that followed. This paved the way for his directorial roles in the first couple Uncharted games, making him a major player in Naughty Dog's 7th generation endeavors. A few years after Straley had signed on with Naughty Dog, another major player had joined the team, an ambitious new computer programmer named Neil Druckmann. Druckmann had long been fascinated with the art of storytelling in video games, having used the likes of classics like LucasArts' Monkey Island as an escape from the violence that occurred around his home settlement in the West Bank of Israel. After moving to the United States, he pursued an education in computer science, obtaining an undergraduate degree at Florida State University before completing a master's program at Carnegie Mellon University in entertainment technology. During his master's program, he attended the Game Developers Conference in 2003 and met with one of Naughty Dog's co-founders, Jason Rubin, who later connected him with an internship under the Jak Daxter series' lead designer, Evan Wells. From here, Druckmann landed himself a full-time position working as a programmer for Naughty Dog, and is credited with a role in some of the gameplay programming for Jak 3, along with the programming for the menu screen in Jak X Combat Racing. But Neil sought to be involved more directly in the design process. So, in his free time, he worked on samples of level designs to demonstrate his capabilities to the newly promoted co-president Evan Wells. Impressed by his innate design capabilities, Wells agreed to move Druckmann over to the design team for the development of Uncharted: Drake's Fortune, where Neil was able to collaborate directly with its creative director and lead writer Amy Hennig, giving him a chance to contribute directly to the game's narrative direction. Following the successful release of the first Uncharted game, Neil was promoted to lead game designer for its highly anticipated sequel, where he embellished even more on the series' iconic cinematic style, cementing his role as a major contributor to Naughty Dog's creative process. With Uncharted 2's groundbreaking success, co-presidents Evan Wells and Christoph Balestra discussed options for the studio moving forward. There was a massive fan demand for more Uncharted, with perfect critical scores and massive sales numbers far surpassing their initial expectations. Though they also saw a persistent demand for additional Jak and Daxter games, a property that they were forced to abandon midway through the development of Drake's Fortune to overcome major developmental hurdles. So, in October of 2009, Naughty Dog was split into two distinct teams, with Amy Hennig and Justin Richmond leading development on Uncharted 3, while Bruce Straley headed up production on a brand new Jak and Daxter, with Neil Druckmann being promoted shortly after to assist as lead writer and creative director. Taking the lessons learned working on the Uncharted series, this new team looked at ways that they could incorporate similar high-quality cinematic experiences with their old sci-fi adventure series. Early concepts showed a total artistic revision to the lead characters, with Jak's exaggerated features like his ears being toned down considerably, while Daxter devolved into more of a silent pet instead of his traditional role as a loud, wisecracking sidekick. But they quickly realized that this redesign would be a massive disservice to the fanbase, who had been waiting for over 5 years to see the beloved duo return to the PlayStation console. So, they ultimately decided to shelf the Jak and Daxter series once again, and instead challenged themselves to create an entirely new IP from scratch. Pre-production for Naughty Dog's newest franchise began in 2009. The team leads, Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley, spent several weeks brainstorming ideas, recycling older concepts that they had toyed around with in the past to establish a firm foundation in which to build their newest game, given the codename Project Thing. One of the earliest concepts for the game originated several years prior, through a contest Druckmann entered during his graduate program at Carnegie Mellon University. The contest involved writing a pitch for a video game that combined the classic zombie apocalypse scenario from Night of the Living Dead with an original gameplay design, and was even judged by the legendary Carnegie Mellon alum himself, George A. Romero. Druckmann's pitch centered around a pair of survivors, an ex-cop with a heart condition who had lost his daughter, and a teenage girl who lost her father, and explored the growth of their relationship throughout the course of a perilous journey, using similar AI-driven cooperative gameplay systems as Japan Studios' 2001 classic, Ico. On the surface, this sounds a lot like what Naughty Dog would eventually create, but Romero wasn't convinced, and chose another student as the winner instead. Shortly after, Neil tried to have the story published as its own standalone comic series instead, given the name The Churning. Only a few small alterations were made to help make the characters more compelling, dropping the male character's background as a police officer and making him an ex-con instead. But this too was turned down, with the publisher quoted saying, "I like it, but I don't love it." But even despite those rejections, the pitch stuck with Neil several years later, and he suggested this Ico-inspired cross-country journey as the key framework from which they would build Naughty Dog's next big game. Though it was Bruce Straley's suggestion that would really get the ball rolling. According to the documentary, spores from this mutated fungus can attach themselves to certain species of insects and grow within their exoskeleton, taking control of the host tissue and controlling their actions. After reaching an ideal location, the fungus then sprouts large ascocarps straight out of the insect, releasing additional spores to continue infecting the rest of the colony. The next day, Bruce showed this disturbing segment to Neil, and suggested having the zombie outbreak in their story be based around this fungus instead, setting it apart from the countless other cliché zombie apocalypse stories being churned out at the time. With this new backdrop to their story now established, the creative team rapidly expanded on the look and feel of their nightmarish apocalyptic scenario, using dozens of other inspirations to help establish the look and feel of the game. The non-fiction novel The World Without Us, for example, helped guide environmental artists in the right direction, as it describes what our modern world might look like if it were reclaimed by nature following an apocalyptic-level pandemic event. Meanwhile, many fictional books and novels helped to flesh out the game's plot, especially The Road, Road to Perdition, True Grit, and City of Thieves, all of which feature a similar, evolving relationship between two characters amid a perilous journey. Though it was the Coen brothers' 2007 classic No Country for Old Men that contributed the most to the game's unique style. According to an interview with Bruce Straley and Neil Druckmann conducted by Game Informer, the film's minimalist direction helped to elevate the tension in a way that they had never seen before, making scenes like the gunfight on the street even more impactful than it would have been in a typical action movie. This brutal, dark, and realistic tone was then introduced liberally throughout every element of the game, steering the direction of the experience away from the bombastic action of games like Uncharted. Once they had firmly established this conceptual picture, the art team began to sketch out designs for the game's characters. One of the earliest characters attempted was the lead protagonist, Joel. At first, this character was intended to appear much younger, with an appearance and attitude similar to Josh Brolin's character in No Country for Old Men. This included a strong, rural Americana style, indicating the character's strong self-reliance and determination. But as the story became more fleshed out, the model evolved slightly, dropping the ponytail in favor of short, messy hair, and aging the character more to help set him apart from the likes of Nathan Drake. Once Joel's general appearance had been agreed upon, they then worked on Ellie, whose look and style was intended to reflect a contrasting innocence, while simultaneously making her independent enough to be able to handle her own. From here, the team then started to rapidly piece together the supporting characters based on input from the writers, all of whom were created with the sole intent of challenging the relationship between Joel and Ellie, thrusting them through a gauntlet of emotional trauma that would be used to drive the characters to their breaking point. The design for the Infected proved to be even more challenging though, as they underwent dozens of redesigns before finally establishing their iconic appearance. Some of those early designs focus on extensive mutations, giving the creatures long tentacles and spikes, though this made them feel too far removed from reality, making them almost fantasy-oriented instead. But once they started experimenting with implementing fungal shells onto the skin, they finally arrived at something that was both beautiful and terrifying, the very same motif used to dictate the design of the game's environments. The world of The Last of Us is very much an exhibit of contrasting tones, with each location mirroring the ups and downs of the story's emotional beats. Darkness, rainfall, and cooler color tones are used during moments of extreme tension and fear, while bright, warm colors, lush plant life, and more natural elements are used to accentuate hopefulness and calm. Once the look and feel of this game world had been agreed upon, programmers and level artists began to work with a heavily modified version of the old Uncharted 2 engine, with the most notable technical improvement being the redesign to the lighting systems, allowing for simulated bounce lighting to make each location be lit more naturally and believably. While all this was going on, the motion capture and creative leads had already begun casting performers for the title roles. For Ellie, The choice became obvious almost immediately, as film actress Ashley Johnson's audition perfectly embodied the spirit of the character. But finding the right voice for Joel required more effort. Several actors auditioned for this role, often matching the physical appearance of the character himself, but none of them really elicited the type of emotional response that was intended. Finally, Naughty Dog brought on board veteran voice actor Troy Baker to play the star role, that, despite his very different outward appearance, proved to be the perfect person for the job. Once the two leads were signed on, Naughty Dog then proceeded to capture both their voice work and motion capture simultaneously, a practice they had adopted during the creation of the Uncharted series, claiming that the actors' most authentic voice performances could only be captured in action, and not separately in a sound booth. When principal photography and recording had been completed, animators then fine-tuned the capture data, tweaking camera angles and making adjustments to the character models to enhance each scene. Some additional voice work was recorded occasionally, but most of the lines were recorded on the motion capture stage itself, resulting in an incredibly authentic presentation. In order to deliver that signature subtlety in the game's musical score, Druckmann reached out to Academy Award-winning musician and composer Gustavo Santaolalla and asked him to score the game using only the core story beats and thematic elements as a guide. The result was a much more natural, percussion-based soundtrack, with a wide range of unconventional instruments used to create unique sounds. The game's signature theme, titled The Last of Us, was one of the first songs Gustavo composed for the project, and was created using an Andean stringed instrument called a ronroco. This was then expanded upon further with additional variations of the theme, along with a few brighter tracks to help mirror the rare happy moment throughout the campaign. Moments of heightened tension, on the other hand, were given a more subtle approach, as the developers wanted to accentuate the game's sound effects more than usual. Sound is often an area neglected in major game productions, with gunfire and explosions being drowned out by brass instruments and sweeping orchestral melodies. But Naughty Dog opted for a less is more approach here too, as they wanted to make encounters with enemies feel more visceral, while also allowing players to use sound to track enemy positions and plan accordingly. To accomplish this, the sound design team, led by former Santa Monica sound engineer Phil Kovacs, overhauled the tech used for the Uncharted series, and introduced new techniques like sound propagation portals, allowing sound to realistically travel down halls and through doorways. But undoubtedly, one of the greatest challenges was the programming of the game's artificial intelligence. Rather than just rehashing Uncharted's over-the-top shooter gallery action, Straley wanted to make The Last of Us feel more intimate and brutal. This meant ensuring that each and every enemy that players faced actually felt like a genuine threat, as opposed to just a mindless grunt shooting from cover. So, the AI system had to be completely rebuilt from scratch, with dynamic pathing and a number of scripts put in place to make enemies react to constantly evolving situations. Because the gameplay also consisted of stealth mechanics, the AI would also need to be able to jump back and forth between aggression states, as opposed to just permanently being in a combat state once triggered.
You're not getting out of here.
The game's companion AI similarly required extensive work. Ellie's presence in the gameplay could easily make or break the entire experience. So the team ensured that while her character model would never actually block the player or their actions, she would still maintain a constant presence in the action, whether that be reacting to a brutal kill, pointing out an enemy off screen that the player might not have noticed, or even providing a distraction so that the player can strike. By the end of 2011, rumors of Naughty Dog's next big adventure had started to circulate. Uncharted 3 had once again put the studio in the spotlight, with rave reviews across the industry further cementing the studio's status. And within only a month, Naughty Dog began to cryptically tease their next game, using the very same BBC documentary footage that inspired production of the game in the first place. Then, at the Spike Video Game Awards show in December of 2011, Naughty Dog unveiled their closely guarded secret, with an in-engine cinematic teaser showcasing a young girl and her violent companion looting a survivor in a dusty hotel room, before being attacked by a group of horribly disfigured, zombie-like creatures. The audience reaction was massively positive. Fans had been clamoring for more original content, and to see it being delivered by the esteemed developers at Naughty Dog only further added to the anticipation. But aside from a few press interviews, the studio remained tight-lipped for the next few months, as they continued to refine the complex AI system, adjust the story direction, and polish the gameplay mechanics. The title was shown off once more at PlayStation's E3 showcase in 2011, this time demonstrating the game in action, with a brief demo of the game's Pittsburgh level that showed off the advanced dynamic AI in action. Players were blown away by the incredible attention to detail, with realistic animations, intelligent characters, and beautiful graphics. But the project was still a long way from completion, as the AI design had to be faked with careful scripting for the demonstration. This would remain a major focus throughout the duration of development, all while the environmental artists continued to toil away at the rest of the levels, and UI designers reconfigured things like the game's crafting and weapon toggle system to feel more satisfying. Finally, after a brief month-long delay, Naughty Dog's first installment to its fourth franchise had gone gold, and in June of 2013, they released The Last of Us, exclusively for the PlayStation 3 console. The Last of Us takes place in the year 2033, with modern society having collapsed following a devastating outbreak of a parasitic fungal infection called cordyceps. To deal with this deadly new threat, the United States government ceded control of the military over to the Federal Disaster Response Agency, or FEDRA, in hopes of circumventing bureaucratic barriers and more effectively containing the infection. FEDRA then erects their own literal barriers to keep the infection at bay, encircling large sections of American cities in quarantine zones, forcing the inhabitants to pass through strict checkpoints just across the street. While seemingly effective at first, these gradually devolve into totalitarian police states, where anyone showing even the slightest hint of infection are executed on the spot, and healthy individuals are forced to endure progressively smaller rations and forced work assignments. But this illusion of control quickly fades, as rebel groups like the Fireflies begin to fight back, often resorting to deadly and indiscriminate guerrilla warfare in hopes of achieving their goals. Meanwhile, the infection outside the walls continues to spread out of control. Bandits called Hunters prey on the weak, and the last remaining remnants of the old world are steadily reclaimed by nature. The player assumes the role of Joel Miller, a hardened weapons smuggler in the Boston quarantine zone, who's become increasingly cynical and depraved after the tragic loss of his daughter during the initial outbreak. While tracking down a set of stolen weapons, Joel and his partner Tess encounter the Firefly leader, who promises them an even more valuable set of firearms and supplies, in exchange for smuggling precious cargo out of the city. The cargo is a 14-year-old girl named Ellie, an impulsive, brash, and often violent teenager, who's revealed to be immune to the cordyceps infection. Begrudgingly, Joel agrees to deliver Ellie to the Fireflies, setting off a chain of events that sees the duo travel across the country in hopes of finding a cure for all of humanity. It's this cross-country journey that forms the backbone of the game's campaign, as players trek through the decaying ruins of Middle America, exploring abandoned towns, scavenging for resources, and contending with a variety of virulent threats. Though, even more crucially, the game's story dedicates a considerable amount to the character development of its two leads, exploring a classic coming-of-age narrative for Ellie, while simultaneously offering Joel a chance at closure. It's a story about love and redemption, all placed into the harshest possible scenario, pushing these characters to their absolute limits as they battle through the worst humanity has to offer.
What are you doing?
Killing time.
Well, what am I supposed to do?
I am sure you will figure that out.
As mentioned previously, the game's narrative takes heavy inspiration from the likes of other similar coming-of-age child and protector-style stories, though The Last of Us offers something slightly different than these characteristically grim tales, striking a careful balance between its brutal and violent moments, with scenes that inspire more hope and beauty, both in how the characters interact with one another and in how the environment itself is portrayed. In fact, the environmental design plays a significant role in enhancing the story in that it's regularly used to further immerse players in Joel and Ellie's developing relationship. Ellie, for example, will sometimes ask Joel about interesting landmarks or old relics from the past, which in turn forces Joel to be more open and talk about his own past experiences, giving players both a window into his character, while also allowing them to relate through their shared understanding of things that we take for granted today.
Oh, I'll be checking in for one night, and I would like your finest suite, please.
The hell are you doing?
Why, yes, you can take my luggage upstairs.
You are a weird kid.
Players will also find handwritten notes left behind throughout the world that piece together tragic stories of the past, adding an extra layer to each area. It's a dark and oppressive setting, but there's an undeniable calm and beauty to it all, as years of human neglect have allowed for nature to reclaim the world, with lush greenery bursting through the brick and concrete, turning urban jungles into literal ones, much in the same way Joel's emotional barriers gradually begin to break away. It's this stark contrast between dark and light that remains a persistent theme all throughout the course of the journey, and is one of the reasons why the story in The Last of Us is widely revered in the gaming community.
Not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
But its beautiful narrative wouldn't mean nearly as much if not for its inventive hybrid of survival horror and tactical stealth action gameplay. Throughout most of the game, players control Joel using a traditional third-person, over-the-shoulder perspective, and guide him through a series of linear environments. Unlike Uncharted's Nathan Drake, Joel isn't nearly as much of an acrobat, forcing him to stick to more practical solutions to obstacles, whether that be a short vault over a rusted car hood, a nasty trudge through some sewer water, or even making use of old wood planks to create a makeshift bridge. Some of these puzzles are even used to further the relationship between the characters, with Joel needing to boost Ellie up to an out-of-reach ladder or unlock a door.
Okay. Ta-da!
Good job.
It's a familiar narrative device to those used to the Uncharted series, though the dynamic between Joel and Ellie is noticeably different, especially considering the heightened risk associated with each decision made. Another major component of the gameplay loop is scavenging for resources. The world of The Last of Us may appear like it's been picked clean, but there's a few items that, while seemingly useless, have the potential to drastically improve the player's odds. Loose bricks and bottles, for example, can be thrown to create a distraction, or alternatively, can be tossed directly at an enemy, making them vulnerable for a devastating follow-up attack. Rusted pipes and 2x4s can also be repurposed as deadly blunt weapons. And the few leftover rounds of ammunition stowed away in various drawers and cabinets can be used to great effect thanks to the game's high lethality with every firearm. In addition to more conventional armaments, raw materials like duct tape, rags, alcohol, sugar, and sharp blades can be combined to create powerful makeshift weapons like Molotov cocktails, nail bombs, smoke bombs, and shivs. The latter of which can be used to break open locks to sealed supply stashes.
There you go.
nice.
This resource gathering also plays directly into the game's progression system as well, as weapon parts and tool sets can be used to unlock weapon upgrades, while supplements can be spent at any time to improve Joel's physical attributes, including maximum health, hearing, crafting speed, and weapon control. To keep players immersed further, all these mechanics are handled in real time, meaning Joel will actually need to physically take off his backpack and shuffle through his resources, while the action resumes in the background. This creates an interesting dynamic for the player, as actions like crafting or healing may leave them vulnerable to threats, adding a nice risk and reward element to the gameplay. Whether the player is prepared or not, The Last of Us's combat is relentlessly savage. Every gunshot has a satisfying kick to it, whether it be the powerful .357 round punching through a hunter, or a buckshot blast, sending the infected flying back. And if the player's not careful, enemies can cut them down within seconds, making careful planning and adaptation key to staying alive.
I'm gonna find you.
Adding to this is the smart artificial intelligence at play that sees enemies steadily adapt to the situation too, by flanking and even tossing their own makeshift weapons at the player to flush them out. To counter this more intelligent AI design, the player can seamlessly transition in and out of the game's stealth mechanics, reinforcing this sort of cat-and-mouse survivalist mindset. If the player feels that they're being overwhelmed, for example, they can suppress the enemy and run to a new position, then carefully maneuver out of sight to set up a new ambush point. To help pinpoint the enemy's position, the game's sound design is purpose-built to amplify things like footsteps and hostile breathing. The players can alternatively press and hold the R2 button on the controller to visualize Joel's hearing, highlighting nearby enemies through walls, making it much easier to plan out attacks. As for the enemy combatants themselves, The Last of Us doesn't go overboard with variety, limiting differences in human enemies to things like their combat chatter style, their equipment, and their cosmetic appearance. Many enemies in the later half of the game do start to wear pieces of armor that force players to choose their shots more carefully, though the general principle remains the same. The infected, on the other hand, are slightly more varied, as each evolutionary stage to the cordyceps infection impacts its host in a different way. The first stage, and one of the most common infected types in the game, are the runners. The runners are people who've only just recently churned, and therefore look slightly more human, though they behave more like the infected in films like 28 Days Later, relentlessly sprinting at the player when alerted and chewing on anything that they can sink their teeth into. The Stalkers demonstrate the second stage of the infection, as the fungal growth begins to bloom outwards, and their voice begins to develop a sort of croak. These enemies tend to stick more closely to the shadows, darting in and out from cover and launching strategic ambushes on unsuspecting players in the dark. With Phase 3, we arrive at the most iconic of The Last of Us's enemy types, the Clicker. By now, the cordyceps is in full bloom, splitting the host's skull and hiding most of their initial facial features. Without eyes, the clickers are forced to rely on their hearing to navigate the world, issuing out loud, unsettling clicking sounds as a form of echolocation. Because clickers are essentially blind, players aren't forced to stay in cover to avoid being detected. The clickers do have improved hearing over other forms of infected, requiring slower movement and the use of distractions to bypass safely. If a clicker happens to live long enough, they may evolve into the fourth and penultimate stage of the infection, the bloater. A bloater is essentially an infected tank, requiring a significant amount of firepower to put down. Each layer of fungus and flesh acts as a sort of armor piece, and at range, they can toss out a toxic cloud of spores, forcing the player to continue to move at all times. These spores are actually the final stage of the cordyceps life cycle, as each infected type will eventually find themselves fused directly into the world, releasing additional spores to spread the infection to new hosts. This doesn't necessarily impact the gameplay in any direct way, though it is used as another story device throughout, with Ellie being the only human that doesn't require a gas mask to navigate through areas filled with spores. Speaking of which, Ellie also assists quite a bit throughout the course of the game's many deadly encounters with enemies. If a player is forced into a corner, for example, Ellie will sometimes leap into action, stabbing the attacker in the back and opening them up for Joel to take down. Ellie can also throw bricks at enemies if the player runs out of ammo, and will even highlight certain targets that the player may not have noticed earlier, ensuring that she's always involved in the action and not just cowering in the corner.
Joel, there's a guy up on that second floor, right there.
Yeah, I see him.
In keeping true with Naughty Dog's tendency towards big, epic set pieces, The Last of Us features a few cinematic moments of its own. Though, just like the combat and traversal systems, these sequences are more grounded and more intimate than something like the train sequence in Uncharted 2, and usually are done to emphasize a critical moment in the story between the characters, as opposed to just looking visually impressive. All in all, the gameplay in The Last of Us provides the perfect vehicle to deliver its fantastic story, expertly weaving together narrative moments in and out of the cutscenes to keep players fully invested in the growth of the characters, while giving plenty of context regarding what exactly is at stake if these two characters don't succeed.
Sweep the area for hunters, but be careful. Move out.
If that wasn't enough, the original PlayStation 3 release of The Last of Us also came packaged with its own online competitive mode called Factions, that incorporates most of the combat, stealth, and on-the-fly crafting used for the campaign to deliver an unexpectedly fun multiplayer component. Factions pits two teams of 4 against each other in 3 different variations of an elimination-style deathmatch. Most of the levels are some variation of the locations used in the campaign, including the high school, Billstown, the university, and the Pittsburgh checkpoint. Only they've been modified slightly in order to account for balance between the two teams.
Nice. Scratch one.
Gunplay remains just as fast and lethal as the single player too, with only a few shots being enough to drop an opponent. Though, unlike the single player, players who are downed have a chance to crawl to safety and be revived by one of their teammates.
Lucky you got my back.
If they can't, the enemy can rush up and finish them off with a few more shots. Or, alternatively, risk performing a humiliating takedown animation in hopes of earning some extra loot. Just like the single player, resources like ammo are in short supply, so taking these kinds of risks can be worth it if it means grabbing some extra bullets. All the crafting items return as well, which play even more crucial roles as things like Molotovs and shivs can be used to instantly kill a player when used properly. To give players the freedom to play to their strengths, Factions lets players create personalized loadouts to choose before deploying onto the field. This can include a handgun, a 2-handed primary, and up to 4 different perks, all of which can be tweaked and modified using the allotted 13 loadout points. A stealth-oriented player, for example, will want to make use of the Covert Training perk that keeps them hidden from an enemy's listen mode. Whereas a player that prefers to stay close to the action and heal their teammates may use a combination of First Aid Training and the Reviver perk to heal and revive their teammates more quickly and efficiently. The weapon upgrades are also handled much differently in the multiplayer. Instead of workbenches, Factions adds a new sub-menu to the player's backpack, where they can spend earned weapon parts, represented here in green, to instantly purchase upgrades to their weapons, along with ammunition, and even a full set of armor plates. The blue supply currency, on the other hand, contributes to Factions' unique metagame in between rounds, where the player needs to earn a minimum amount of supplies each match in order to maintain a community of survivors. This system is key to Factions' addictive nature, as poor player performance in a string of matches will fail to keep their personal community of survivors healthy, causing sick individuals to appear in the population and slowly die out. This is then added to further thanks to unique special events every few matches that force the player to accept a specific challenge to either earn bonus supplies or prevent a large group of survivors from being killed. By maintaining a healthy community, Factions eventually rewards players with unique cosmetic items that otherwise wouldn't be accessible, allowing them to show off with rare vanity gear. It's a simple yet intense 4v4 gameplay experience, highly reminiscent of classic third-person tactical shooters of the PS2 generation. And while it has received several additions over the first few years thanks to multiplayer map pack expansions, it also added with it paid weapons and perk add-ons, adding a potential pay-to-win element that hasn't aged particularly well. Though multiplayer DLC wasn't the only extra content for fans to take in. Shortly after the release of the original game, Naughty Dog partnered with the comic book publisher Dark Horse Comics to create a limited-run comic book series that would expand on story elements initially planned to be part of the game's campaign. The comics, given the name The Last of Us American Dreams, focus on Ellie's time in the Boston quarantine zone prior to the events of the main campaign, and chronicles her and her new best friend Riley's adventures at a nearby abandoned shopping mall. While these 4 comics were all positively received on their own, their more significant contribution to the series is how they influenced the direction of The Last of Us's sole story expansion, Left Behind. According to the game's director Bruce Straley, Left Behind offered an opportunity to fully explore this friendship between Ellie and Riley, while also filling in a significant gap partway through the original game. This led the team to split the expansion between 2 different timelines that are used to help create an interesting contrast between Ellie's childhood innocence and the dark path she's been sent down as a result of the events that transpired. Another interesting aspect of this expansion is this increased emphasis on story-driven experiences, with entire lengthy sections being completely devoid of typical combat encounters, in favor of more lighthearted and silly moments. For the sections that do feature combat, Left Behind offers the unique opportunity to pit 2 factions of enemies against each other, with Ellie capable of luring out hordes of infected and using them against a rival group of hunters. Though, for many gamers, the biggest takeaway from this expansion was the surprise romantic revelation for the character Ellie, that once more strengthened the series' dedication to inclusive representation during a time in gaming where this just wasn't typical. When all was said and done, The Last of Us was considered by many to be a masterpiece, with perfect scores by nearly every major media outlet. The game was praised extensively for its beautiful storytelling, excellent voice and motion capture performances, and its general delivery, with some even claiming it to be the very best game to ever release on the PlayStation 3. Others highlighted The Last of Us's innovative gameplay, pointing out that it successfully separated itself from the overly saturated survival horror post-apocalyptic market, thanks to its reliance on intimate combat encounters mixed with dynamic stealth and artificial intelligence. Then, of course, there was the presentation, which at the time was an incredible feat for the aging PlayStation 3, proving that even in its final year, Sony's 7th gen console still had the potential to drive some of the very best looking games in the industry. On top of this, The Last of Us was also complimented for its depiction of female characters, an aspect that in 2013 wasn't quite as prevalent as it is today. Ellie's character in particular offered a refreshingly grounded and believable female lead, avoiding the trap of making her a weak and helpless escort objective, or some sort of prize to be won by the protagonist. And then there's supporting characters like Tess, Marlene, Maria, and the expansion's Riley, that, like Ellie, were portrayed as being independent, intelligent, and often in some kind of leadership role. The Last of Us also received praise for its inclusion of LGBTQ characters that again were very rare for the time, especially in a major AAA production. Overall, The Last of Us was a massively successful title for both Naughty Dog and PlayStation. The game's extensive marketing and early positive press resulted in record-breaking sales numbers, with over 1 million copies sold in only the first week, and several more million in the months that followed. It went on to win dozens of awards at a variety of different award ceremonies, including Best Actor performances for both Baker and Johnson, Best Story, Best Graphics, Best Action Adventure Game, and Game of the Year from sites like IGN. But what's more, The Last of Us served as the perfect swan song for Naughty Dog's near-perfect run on the PlayStation 3, and the studio quickly turned their attention towards the next generation.
So is that everything you hoped for?
Jury's still out. But man, can't deny that view.
Shortly after work had completed with the base game, a handful of programmers and artists shifted over to working on an enhanced version of The Last of Us, designed to take advantage of the upcoming PlayStation 4 console.
You ever stay at a place like this?
No, this is too rich for my blood.
This version, dubbed The Last of Us Remastered, changed very little of the original game's core design. Most of the changes here are minor and technical, improving the quality of life and bringing the game up to the standards gamers expected in 2014. With the PS4's drastically improved CPU, graphics chip, and memory capacity, Naughty Dog were able to scale up the visuals a decent amount, improving things like texture resolution, shadow density, lighting effects, and massively improving the average performance. The team were even able to push the game up to a locked 60 frames per second at a native 1080p, with an option for a locked 30 FPS available to players that preferred the classic feel of the PS3 release. In addition to these technical improvements, Naughty Dog also experimented with some of the new hardware-specific features afforded to them by the PS4. The new touchpad, for example, is used in place of the old select button for accessing the player's backpack. The light bars change their color relative to the player's health, and audio recording devices now play their audio straight through the small speaker on the controller itself.
We lost 2 more guards to infected attacks.
One of the PS4's biggest selling points in its early years was its dedication to sharing moments with friends and communities, with the new Share button allowing for a way to instantly post screenshots and videos of gameplay online. To accompany this element, Naughty Dog added in a dedicated photo mode, allowing players to instantly pause the game and move the camera around Joel or Ellie in order to capture detailed close-ups of the action. Alongside these few PS4-specific additions, The Last of Us Remastered also includes all previously released downloadable content directly on the disc, including the Left Behind expansion and some of the multiplayer map and weapon packs as well. Aside from that though, The Last of Us Remastered is the same game as the original PS3 version, maintaining the original vision that so many gamers had fallen in love with. The remaster was met with a similarly positive response from audiences, noting the smoother 60 FPS and crisper environments as essential improvements to an already perfect game. Audiences were similarly happy with special offers made by game distributors like Target that allowed for a trade-in deal to receive the new remaster at nearly half the list price. But the most important aspect of The Last of Us Remastered, at least when it comes to the legacy of the franchise, is that it provided Naughty Dog invaluable experience working on the latest tech, giving them a better footing moving into the next generation. A few months before the release of The Last of Us Remastered, Naughty Dog were faced with an unexpected exodus, as veteran writer and director Amy Hennig suddenly resigned from the studio. This was then followed by director Justin Richmond and lead artist Nate Well shortly after, prompting many to speculate that something was wrong over at the esteemed kennel. This departure would also cause some major logistic problems, as the previous 2-team system was now forced to focus on only one major project at a time. So while a team of designers and artists continued some preliminary work for the next Last of Us game, studio heads like Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley were tasked with replacing Hennig and Richmond as heads for the 4th Uncharted game, a project that required nearly 8 months worth of rewrites to get back on track. This resulted in a slight shift in tone for the light-hearted action-adventure series, no doubt using lessons learned from The Last of Us to create a more mature Uncharted adventure. More diverse characters were also incorporated into the core plot, including a secondary antagonist, Nadine Ross, whose powerful presence added a unique twist to the formula. Alongside these story changes, Uncharted 4 also became one of the studio's most strenuous projects to date, as every aspect of the experience could now be hugely expanded upon thanks to the increase in computing power on the PlayStation 4. The character models, for example, went from utilizing roughly 250 animation bones from head to toe, to nearly 800 in just the faces alone. Their motion capture studio had also been updated to account for this, allowing for more subtle gestures from performers to be picked up during recording, resulting in vastly improved cinematic quality. But again, this was an extremely difficult process, and with deadlines constantly being stretched, crunch became a common practice in the later half of development, putting a heavy toll on the many talented developers at the studio. By the end of production, Naughty Dog saw an even larger exodus from its kennel, with Kotaku reporting nearly 70% of the studio's designers stepping away after Uncharted 4's release. According to an analysis by LinkedIn, that's about 55% higher than the average turnover rate in the game development industry. No doubt the result of the studio's taxing development process, necessary to deliver on Uncharted 4's ambitious promises. More senior-level employees parted ways too, including longtime co-president Christoph Balestra, who had served alongside Evan Wells since 2004. Even former game director Bruce Straley felt he needed a break and stepped away for roughly a year, before officially resigning in September of 2017. But despite all these high-profile departures, those who remained committed to delivering even more remarkable gameplay experiences, and the focus shifted towards the next major project. Even before the original game had hit store shelves, Druckmann had begun to brainstorm ideas for the story to an inevitable sequel, looking at new journeys that these characters could take, and what kind of emotional force would push them to want to take those journeys. One of the earliest concepts Druckmann considered was a story centered around Ellie, who would learn about another person like her that was immune to the cordyceps infection. But as he began to draft out this idea, it became clear that the base story would just be more the same, with the lead characters going through hell on Earth to find the cure to humanity. This, according to statements made in the official Last of Us podcast, would have been a mistake. The original game is considered by many to be a masterpiece, and trying to replicate that success by just going through slightly different story beats would be a disservice to its fanbase. So Druckmann looked at the story from a broader, thematic perspective. If the original game's core concept revolved around love, and what we as humans are capable of doing to preserve that, then what if the sequel went in the complete opposite direction? What if the sequel explored the essence of hatred? Using this as the basis for the plot, Neil drafted out an extensive outline for a new game within only a few weeks. He then brought this idea to Straley, who provided additional input and suggestions on where to take the characters. From here, the team began to create prototypes for what would eventually become The Last of Us Part 2. But right before they could enter into full-scale development, they were both asked to take over for Hennig and Richmond on Uncharted 4, leaving the next Last of Us game on the back burner. Fast forward to 2016, and production on the next Last of Us game could finally begin, with nearly 350 programmers, designers, and artists transitioning over fully to working on creating Joel and Ellie's next big adventure. To account for the departure of Straley, Naughty Dog promoted two former game designers, Anthony Newman and Kurt Markenau, to fill his shoes, marking the first time in the studio's history of having two game directors for a single project. Around the same time, Hallie Gross, a screenwriter for the hit HBO sci-fi drama Westworld, was brought on as a lead co-writer, taking the broad story ideas pitched by Druckmann and expanding upon them, adding crucial connective tissue to formulate a more cohesive plot. Once the general premise for the story had been agreed upon, the writers then brought it over to the design team, who offered their own suggestions to not only expand on the characters through things like dialogue, but also in how the actual gameplay systems and pacing would work to deliver the story in the most meaningful way possible. The first concept for the game involved a large, open-ended world, with multiple explorable hub areas like Jackson being used to deliver important story sequences. To play into this, the team introduced several brand new characters as well, including a new antagonist that would be playable throughout a large chunk of the first act. But this was later scaled down for the sake of pacing, and reworked to enhance the narrative further. As these many narrative ideas were being fleshed out, the programming and design team launched into full-scale development. They made use of many of the techniques established during the creation of Uncharted 4, including the partial animation system for characters interacting with objects, the more complex, physics-based environmental elements like ropes and destructible assets, and a massively expanded scale to the overall playable space. The studio's advanced motion capture techniques were improved on too, as the team not only captured all the human actors with increased precision on the set, but even strapped actual dogs and horses with motion capture sensors, a necessity in order to introduce these animals into the core gameplay. By the end of 2016, Naughty Dog had officially revealed their plans for the sequel, showcasing an impressive in-engine cinematic, heavily inspired by the original teaser from 2011. Only instead of the duo simply fighting for survival, this teaser showed a much darker side to Ellie, desperate for revenge against a group of people for an unknown reason.
I'm gonna kill every last one of them.
Following this initial showing, development for the second Last of Us game ramped up significantly, as developers who had just wrapped up work on Uncharted: The Lost Legacy were brought over to assist. A lot of the production effort went into building out the environments that had now taken on a similarly linear approach to those used in the previous game. Hallie Gross also worked closely with the design team to continue to expand on the story, adding in dozens of new characters to challenge Ellie both physically and emotionally. In fact, Hallie was involved in a majority of the writing for the sequel, as Neil stepped away from the writing side of things after being promoted to vice president of the studio in 2018. That being said, he wasn't entirely absent from the picture either, as he continued to oversee the tonal direction and actor performances in the mocap studio. A follow-up to the popular Factions multiplayer had also been planned initially, but this was later set aside, as the game's extremely ambitious scope made any additional game modes impossible within their time constraints. This was because a lot of the same issues seen with Uncharted 4's production reared their head once more, with an extremely demanding crunch resulting in some employees working regular 12-hour workdays, which was exacerbated further during the aforementioned mass exodus of employees. As the project rolled into 2020, production was complicated further due to an actual real-world pandemic, forcing the studio to adapt to a new work-from-home production method. This forced the game's release date back several months, from an initial February 20th target all the way to May 29th. It was then hit again with a delay a few months later, this time with a concerning indefinite attached to it, suggesting that something was seriously wrong with the project. But Naughty Dog later pushed back on this sentiment, confirming that the game was close to crossing the finish line. And sure enough, in June of 2020, they released the long-anticipated The Last of Us Part 2, exclusively for the PlayStation 4. The Last of Us Part 2 takes place shortly after the events of the original game, with Joel and Ellie having returned to the small mountain town of Jackson, Wyoming, following their year-long trip across the country. Because of its uniquely isolated location in Teton County, Jackson has been able to effectively weather the storm of the post-pandemic world, with hundreds of survivors all working together to cultivate a society reminiscent of the world before. People own their own houses, run small businesses, and maintain agriculture and livestock. Kids play on playgrounds, teenagers attend dances. It's almost as if the world had never collapsed. But the world outside the walls has only gotten worse. The infected have begun to migrate, collecting into large herds as they spread across rural America, and have begun to mutate further into horrific abominations more grotesque than ever before. Meanwhile, groups of human survivors have evolved into more powerful militaristic factions, resulting in bloody conflicts with rival factions as they attempt to control the steadily declining supply of finite resources. Before long, this reality becomes known to the people of Jackson, when a mysterious militia group known as the WLF launch a seemingly unprovoked attack against their community, forever fracturing the illusion of peace that its inhabitants had previously believed possible. The player assumes the role of a now 19-year-old Ellie, who, alongside her new friends, travels to Seattle in search of retribution. It's here where the bulk of Part 2's story takes place, as players comb the ruins of this old city in search of clues. But it soon becomes clear that the situation in the city is far more complicated than they had anticipated, forcing them to systematically hunt down high-profile targets, while simultaneously avoiding swarms of infected, occupying militants, and an unhinged cult of religious fanatics called the Seraphites. As the story unfolds, Part 2 delves deep into themes regarding morality, vengeance, and the consequences of one's actions, often challenging the player to question whether the ends justify the means, and how an obsession with vengeance can perpetuate a never-ending cycle of violence. It's also significantly more character-driven than its predecessor, exploring Ellie's relationships both past and present to demonstrate what she's lost and how far she's willing to go to protect those she loves. But what really sets the sequel apart is its secondary protagonist, Abby. Abby is an incredibly unique character in this game, as she also serves as the primary antagonist opposite Ellie. By making Abby playable, players are given a different perspective on the events that unfold throughout the course of the game's initial 3-act structure, with a separate set of supporting characters, scenarios, and for the most part, even a different conflict altogether. It almost feels like a separate game all on its own, but as the events continue to unfold, the narratives inevitably converge, resulting in a powerful confrontation that completely upends any preconceived notions established throughout the course of the game's initial acts.
We let you both live, and you wasted it!
From a much broader perspective, Part 2 does continue to highlight the nature of humanity, demonstrating the extreme lengths that people will go in the face of desperation. The new factions introduced help to emphasize this point, as the conflicting ideologies of the WLFs and the Seraphites all demonstrate the human capacity for both compassion and cruelty. Alongside this, the sequel also takes a much bolder approach to its inclusivity, expanding substantially on the previous game's feminist and LGBTQ themes, while also greatly diversifying its new characters, illustrating the impact of a post-apocalyptic world on a broader range of people in ways that feel meaningful and authentic. The story is much more ambitious than the original game, as it seeks to expand greatly on the core premise of the cordyceps virus, while also delving deeper into the psyches of its complex characters, creating a narrative that's not only challenging, but also more expansive overall, an aspect that is reflected directly in the sequel's much larger playable space. The ruins of Seattle are gorgeously detailed, with towering skyscrapers and abandoned vehicles hidden behind thick layers of overgrowth and decay. And due to excessive bombing, many of the city streets have been transformed into powerful river rapids, forcing survivors to make use of elevated structures to traverse safely. Despite being a singular location, this extensive overgrowth provides the city of Seattle with a remarkable amount of level variety, with massive sprawling valleys giving way to dense interior areas, once again giving players a chance to explore the ruins of easily recognizable facets of Western society, and how they would be impacted by an apocalyptic scenario.
Oh my god.
Oh, you don't see that every day.
Thanks to the increased capability of the PS4 hardware, these locations are also much larger than levels in the first game, taking cues from Naughty Dog's previous work on Uncharted 4 and its standalone expansion, The Lost Legacy, to create an extremely large hub area in one of the game's earliest acts. Much like the university level featured in the first game, the downtown Seattle area can be traversed on horseback, with players able to freely dismount and explore any location that piques their interest. Only this time, players are also given a helpful area map to reference, that Ellie will automatically take out and mark whenever players pass by a noteworthy area, encouraging extensive exploration and discovery. The game does eventually transition back to a more traditional format, using open-ended linear level designs bookended by key narrative moments. Though even these areas feel better realized, as there's dozens of fully explorable storefronts along the path, often housing invaluable tools and resources deep within. Like before, a big part of The Last of Us Part 2's gameplay loop revolves around gathering resources, whether that be scraps of cloth, bottles and tape, or a handful of bullets hastily left behind. To make these frequent moments of environmental exploration more meaningful, Part 2 incorporates a more complex animation system that sees the characters realistically interact with objects, like opening drawers with one hand while using their free hand to grab the item inside, or physically picking up notes and examining them directly, as opposed to the note just appearing on the screen like before. Locked safes also require players to input the code directly this time, rather than just finding a note with the code written on it and having the safe open up automatically. Even the codes themselves seem to have more thought put into them, as they rarely spell out the combination directly, and instead hint at the solution with clever clues, often requiring players to study the environment to discover the answer. To address complaints regarding the extensive use of ladder and pallet puzzles used prior, Part 2's occasional use of environmental puzzle solving is more varied, often requiring players to manipulate the game's physics systems. Many times, this ties into the inclusion of a new rope gameplay mechanic, that, much like Uncharted 4, allows players to pick up a bundle of rope and throw it over objects in order to swing or climb vertically and reach higher platforms. In fact, the verticality of the gameplay across the board is greatly expanded in the sequel, with many locations incorporating multiple elevation points, often playing into the inclusion of dedicated climbing and jumping controls. The verticality is also incorporated a great deal into the game's many combat scenarios, requiring players to carefully plan out their attacks and adapt to constantly evolving situations using all the tools and abilities at their disposal. These combat systems have been extensively overhauled in the sequel, using lessons learned from Uncharted 4 to create a more dynamic blend of stealth action and gunplay. Like before, a big part of this is the game's artificial intelligence that sees human enemies behave realistically during engagements, often looking for flanking opportunities to take down the player.
Zoe, flank them!
Roger that!
Only now, the enemy AI can also utilize faction-specific tactics to diversify each encounter. The wolves, for example, sometimes deploy dogs to track the player's scent, requiring persistent movement to avoid detection. The Seraphites, on the other hand, utilize more guerrilla tactics, whistling to each other to disguise their communication, and ambushing the player with bows and arrows from hidden vantage points. Enemy AI will even refer to each other by name during combat,
Chris?
adding an extra layer of realism to every fight.
Someone killed Chris! There's someone here!
Then, of course, there's the Infected, that play a much more active role throughout the course of the game. Like the Left Behind expansion before, human factions and Infected can sometimes be found within the same area, giving players the opportunity to use the Infected as a helpful distraction, or even as a deadly weapon. The Infected themselves are mostly the same as before, with runners and clickers all behaving as expected. Though the bloaters feel more imposing this time around, often with their own dedicated space that they can rip apart, making their battles feel more like full-on boss fights.
Got you, asshole!
And the Stalkers have been modified a bit too, as their ambushing strategies feel better realized, keeping players on their toes when encroaching on their territory. Part 2 also sees the introduction of the Shambler, a waterlogged 4th stage variant of the cordyceps infection that's developed large pustules all over its body that it uses to spew out toxic acid into the air. While not as powerful as the bloaters, the Shamblers do require a decent amount of damage to take down, and when mixed in with other forms of infected, they can quickly overwhelm players that find themselves cornered. Alongside this, Part 2's violence has been cranked up several notches, adding in more authentic damage models for each weapon, along with new dynamic animations depending on the type of injury. Shooting an enemy in the leg, for example, has the chance to cripple an enemy temporarily, leaving them open for a follow-up attack. And using higher caliber weapons can sometimes sever the limb completely, causing the victim to let out a blood-curdling scream. Sometimes, the final enemy in a fight will even surrender, giving players a chance to perform a brutal takedown with whichever weapon they want, an aspect that ties in directly to the game's overarching themes regarding violence.
Damn, Ellie.
Part 2 also sees some slight refinement to the gunplay itself, cleaning up the weapon recoil animation to make each weapon feel more authentic and powerful. Many of the guns from the previous game return, like the revolver, semi-auto pistol, pump shotgun, and the bolt-action rifle. Though, thanks to the inclusion of Abby, there's also a full suite of new weapons to play around with, allowing her gameplay to stand apart significantly from Ellie's chapters. These include a semi-automatic rifle, a single-shot hunting pistol, similar to the El Diablo from the first game, a double-barrel over-under shotgun, another flamethrower, and a tactical crossbow that, unlike Ellie's bow and arrow, can be fired more quickly with less chance of the bolts breaking on impact. The game's crafting system is similarly tailor-made for either character, as Ellie can craft more ambush-oriented items like Molotovs, smoke bombs, mines, and explosive-tip arrows, while Abby's gear seems to be more combat-oriented, with things like throwable pipe bombs, incendiary shotgun shells, and the ability to craft additional hunting pistol rounds. Either character can also craft new makeshift pistol suppressors that can be manually attached to take down enemies silently at range. When ranged attacks aren't an option, the player can take advantage of the sequel's greatly expanded melee combat systems that include a wider variety of melee weapons, more satisfying attack animations, and a new dodge feature, allowing for intense close-quarter confrontations with various enemy types. These systems also consider the physicality of either character, as Abby's moves feel more controlled and deliberate, while Ellie's attacks highlight her overall inexperience and desperation, once again emphasizing the stark contrast between these two individuals. Accompanying these new combat and takedown animations are a slew of new stealth-based abilities as well, that enable players to transition in and out of combat much more easily. To accomplish this, Part 2's encounters often feature unique escape routes for players to take advantage of, like small gaps in the walls that Ellie and Abby can squeeze through in order to get the jump on enemies. Many combat scenarios even incorporate the game's expanded swimming mechanics to some degree, with intricate underwater paths allowing for quick getaways, and Navy SEAL-style ambushes. But the most prominent of these new features is the ability to drop into a prone position and crawl around on the ground. Not only does this position make firearms significantly more accurate, but players can also snake their way through tall grass to avoid detection, and crawl underneath low-hanging objects. However, these hiding places aren't foolproof, as more wary enemies will be sure to check, and will even drag the player out if they're discovered. The game's player progression system remains more or less the same as before. Weapon parts found in the environment can be traded at weapon benches to upgrade the player's firearms, though tool sets are not required this time to unlock higher quality upgrades, likely to account for the additional set of weapons available to Abby that also need to be upgraded. Meanwhile, the supplement-based skill upgrades have been modified slightly into a more traditional skill tree format, with 5 categories per character, each reflecting a different aspect of that character's abilities. For Ellie, these categories include survival, crafting, stealth, precision, and explosives. Whereas Abby's skill trees are again more combat-oriented and include things like field tactics, covert ops, close-quarter combat, firearm training, and ordnance, only further reinforcing the differences between either protagonist. When considering all of these changes, Part 2's gameplay systems indicate a considerable evolution over the original game's much simpler design, with a more expansive playable area, more immersive gameplay mechanics, and a few improvements to the few minor issues that some critics pointed out before. But the inclusion of Abby pushes it all even further, as it essentially doubles up the amount of content, providing a richer experience as a result. The downside to this, however, is the game's pacing doesn't feel nearly as tight, as it greatly builds up the anticipation over the course of several acts with Ellie, only to drop the player back to square one and do it all over again once they begin playing as Abby. And this, combined with the inherent hatred players are intended to have towards this character early on, only further contributed to what can best be described as a mixed response at launch. Despite significant effort to differentiate the experience and build upon the monumental success of the original, The Last of Us Part 2 came out of the gate stumbling due to an unexpected leak of one of the game's most closely guarded narrative secrets. Without context, the leak prompted significant backlash from fans, with some going as far as issuing death threats to writers and actors involved in the project. But this extreme response was not shared by everyone, In fact, the game was met with overwhelmingly positive reviews from most major publications, noting the game's beautiful storytelling, gorgeous visual direction, and massively improved gameplay mechanics. Some did still take issue with the game's brutal violence, claiming that it took away from the statement that the narrative intended to make, while others criticized the game for its unusual style of pacing. Then, upon its full release, Part 2 was met with an even harsher response from audiences, with user reviews dropping the game's average score several grades all within the first few hours. Many of these reviews directed their frustration towards the game's leaked plot points and criticized the game's inclusivity as being politically driven, while others simply disagreed with the narrative choices that were made, feeling it was too much of a departure from the style of storytelling offered in the first game. However, the sentiment has since simmered, with the average audience score having slowly returned to an even 50%, as opposed to the 30% it received at launch. Audiences still remain mixed on the game's story, accusing it of trying too hard to subvert expectations, though others feel the opposite, arguing the game's bold choices help it to stand apart from its predecessor and provide a more mature character-driven experience than any of Naughty Dog's prior work. Regardless, The Last of Us Part 2 still managed to break records, becoming the fastest-selling PlayStation 4 exclusive, even over the highly successful God of War reboot and Insomniac's Spider-Man. On top of this, the game has gone on to achieve a multitude of awards, including over 320 Game of the Year awards from across the industry, along with many other awards for writing, audio design, and performances. In the end, Part 2 is considered by many to be another masterpiece, and even a swan song for the PlayStation 4 console, just like the original Last of Us was a swan song for the PlayStation 3. But unlike the original game, this sentiment has not garnered nearly as much of a consensus, leaving many to wonder where Naughty Dog would take the series next. Shortly after The Last of Us Part 2 had been shipped off for certification, a small selection of San Diego-based developers belonging to Sony Corporation's Visual Arts Service Group looked at ways to strengthen their position within the company, and sought to transition from their traditional support role into becoming an official first-party PlayStation studio. To make this transition more feasible, the small team of roughly 30 developers agreed to begin development on a remake of Naughty Dog's beloved 2013 classic, using the improved rendering capabilities created throughout the development of its sequel. But it soon became clear that the project would require significantly more funding and manpower than previously anticipated, leading Sony to transition the bulk of production back over to Naughty Dog instead. It was around this time that rumors began to swirl in the industry, as reports like those made by Bloomberg in 2021 revealed that one of Sony's first-party studios, Sony Ben, had been denied a chance to work on a sequel to their newest IP, Days Gone, in order to assist Naughty Dog with their more financially viable IPs instead. The report also revealed information regarding a then unannounced remake to The Last of Us, leaving many understandably confused and frustrated, questioning why a game as widely beloved and relatively recent warranted a remake at all. But the newly assigned team at Naughty Dog looked at the project as a unique opportunity. The remaster of The Last of Us had proven exceptionally useful in training the studio in how to build games on the newer PS4 dev kits. And with lessons learned from the development of Part 2, they felt that the experience could now be fully unified, with a more consistent visual style and integration of newer gameplay mechanics. They initially considered integrating some of the bigger gameplay improvements introduced with Part 2, like the ability to go prone and the ability to dodge melee attacks. But they quickly discovered that these types of additions would not only negatively impact the game's intended difficulty, but also require a total rework of each level environment, with larger spaces for animations to play out and new paths to take advantage of new stealth capabilities. So instead, they settled on much more subtle additions, like the more immersive workbench animations for upgrading weapons, or the ability to read notes held directly in Joel's hands, as these features serve to enhance the experience further, rather than change it into something else. A lot of these same choices were made when deciding on the improvements to the remake's visuals. The art designers poured through the entirety of the original game and looked at every corner of each room volume to determine what could be changed without hurting the core aesthetic. Rooms and hallways that were previously empty in the original game were almost always done out of necessity, as the old PS3 hardware had forced the team to be conservative with asset placement and only decorate areas that would demand more focus from the player. But now, with the PlayStation 5, these constraints were lifted, allowing artists to pour in detail into every part of the game, whether it be the larger, more clearly defined main path, or the off-the-beat small room only the most dedicated explorers might discover. To ensure the original layout and scaling remained intact, the environmental artist made use of the original geometry of the first game and imported it into the 3D modeling software Maya, where they then built entirely new assets over top of the footprint of the old, and embellished on them with new 4K texture maps and vastly superior shader work. The team also looked at pre-existing assets that may have detracted from the old design, and either changed or removed distracting elements in hopes of refining the overall presentation. Meanwhile, the lighting team incorporated a plethora of new lighting techniques throughout the experience, adding in new direct lights, higher fidelity volumetrics, and even new reflective surfaces that not only add more realism to each scene, but even play a direct role in the gameplay, as some mirrors can be used to see around corners and locate approaching enemies. The increased memory capacity also allows for major improvements to the game's artificial intelligence, including the addition of a more efficient encounter manager layer that's used to dynamically assign roles to individual NPCs in order to help them determine the best paths to flank the player, and strategically important areas to defend. While the gameplay and visual presentation of each environment were refined, a separate team, led by veteran lead animator Sean Eskig, looked at ways to update the game's all-important cinematics, transitioning them to being rendered in real time, while incorporating dozens of visual enhancements to deliver the minor subtlety of the original performances that may have been missing prior. Things like tears running down characters' faces, spit when a character yells, and general improvements to the complexity of facial muscles all help to contribute to a far more authentic look for each respective character, bringing it more in line with the cinematic direction utilized in the sequel. Another major focus for the remake was its accessibility, an aspect that had long been overlooked in the industry. By hiring accessibility consultants, Naughty Dog were able to integrate several user-friendly features into the revamped experience, including a variety of colorblind options, difficulty sliders, and even a unique dialogue haptic system that takes advantage of the DualSense controller's advanced vibration motors to emphasize emotional intensity of character dialogue, providing slightly more context to players with impaired hearing. Then, after about 2 years of development, Naughty Dog officially revealed the long-rumored remake, and The Last of Us Part 1 released worldwide in September of 2022. Part 1 is pretty much a shot-for-shot remake of the original game, with an identical story, identical level layouts, and even all the same gameplay systems, enemy types, and upgrades. Changes here are almost exclusively cosmetic-based, as the game now makes use of the improved rendering techniques built for the sequel. As such, the game's high entry price left many fans frustrated. Reviews for the game remained generally positive, with a familiar praise for the game's story and gameplay, coupled with compliments for the gorgeous visual upgrade and extreme attention to detail. Though many critics did share concerns with the fanbase in regard to the game's steep price point, and criticized the release for once again neglecting the old Factions multiplayer mode, that at this point only lived on through the remastered PS4 release due to the closure of the original PS3 servers in 2019. But it wasn't until the spring of 2023 that issues with the remake really started to materialize, thanks to the release of the long-awaited PC port of the game. Assisted in part by the Chicago-based development studio Iron Galaxy, The Last of Us Part 1 on the PC arrived in a miserable state for PC gamers, with an unusually long shader compilation screen forcing players with moderate to low-end hardware to wait extremely long before playing after each update. The port also requires players to have a significant amount of VRAM with their GPU, lest they suffer from serious problems with high-resolution texture retrieval, causing some users to endure lower than usual texture resolutions. But the biggest issue lies in the game's CPU utilization, that even with the top-of-the-line AMD or Intel chips, can severely bottleneck enthusiast-level graphics cards, resulting in an unstable and uncharacteristically unpolished Naughty Dog-made product. The port has since received several updates, each attempting to improve performance for a wider range of configurations. In fact, I've had to come back to this script several times over the course of the past few months just to update this particular section. As of mid-June, The Last of Us Part 1 on the PC has finally entered into a playable state, with acceptable performance far exceeding its initial launch state. The game has even been given the official green checkmark for verification on Valve's portable Steam Deck, allowing gamers to finally take Joel and Ellie's adventure with them on their own journeys. Though, while the PC version does allow for a higher average frame rate and a few PC-exclusive cosmetic items, the PS5 version of The Last of Us Part 1 still remains the ideal way to experience The Last of Us, at least in video game form. Around the same time, another take on the classic story had emerged, this time by means of a star-studded live-action adaptation through HBO. Written by Chernobyl's Craig Mazin and one of the original game's creators, Neil Druckmann, The Last of Us HBO provides an even more intimate retelling of Joel and Ellie's cross-country journey, starring Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey in the starring roles. This version of the story shares a lot of similarities to the beloved video game narrative, even going as far as maintaining identical dialogue and shot angles for its most emotionally powerful scenes. However, the HBO show also deviates significantly at times, cutting more gameplay-oriented action sequences in favor of more character-driven moments instead. Bill, for example, who previously is only shown as a temporary companion through a few chapters in the game, is now given his own dedicated episode that explores how he transformed his small town into a personal fortress, while also diving deeper into his relationship with his partner Frank. Sam, on the other hand, has been reimagined to be deaf, only communicating with characters with sign language and a special pad and pen, adding a unique element never explored before in the games. One of the biggest changes, though, is the total rework to the mechanics of the cordyceps infection, dropping the old spores concept entirely in favor of a new, more disturbing tendril design that the writers felt was more consistent with the actual cordyceps biology. However, the infected overall seemed to be less prevalent in this version of the story, as many of their sequences were more gameplay-driven before, and therefore unnecessary to deliver on the previous story beats. Alongside these changes, The Last of Us show also sees the inclusion of some of the talent from the games too, with Jeffrey Pierce, Merle Dandridge, Troy Baker, and Ashley Johnson all being given significant roles throughout the show. Reception to the show has been exceptionally positive, with near unanimous praise from most critics, citing the dedication to preserving the game's story and tone, while also boldly experimenting with new ideas and taking full advantage of the different medium to create something fresh. Pascal and Ramsey were also praised for their performances, as they helped channel the performances of Baker and Johnson, while still making the characters their own. But most importantly, the show's high level of quality and attention to detail helped circumvent the industry's most infamous taboo, finally setting the stage for more mature and faithful video game-based stories to be told, and possibly setting the stage for a major shift in direction for the film and TV industry. Which finally brings us to today, a full decade after the original game's release. While admittedly a much smaller franchise than other games that I've covered on this channel, The Last of Us has become a true tour de force in the video game industry. The series has gone from a loose collection of ideas and film inspirations into becoming one of the most popular and beloved stories in the history of the medium, and has since inspired countless other games to follow in its footsteps, with more meaningful and mature narrative directions for their own stories. Of particular note is the reboot to the God of War series, that centers around a bond between father and child during the course of a perilous journey. What's more, The Last of Us has helped to transcend the medium and become a beloved television show, a feat very few other game franchises, if at all, can claim to have achieved, especially not at the same level of success. But the real question on everyone's mind is, where will the series go from here? What can we expect from Naughty Dog, or from HBO, or even PlayStation in regards to this grim but thought-provoking series? All we know for sure at this time is that Naughty Dog has been hard at work for the past several years building a new standalone multiplayer experience based on the world of The Last of Us. This project was initially intended to be tied in directly to the release of Part 2, but it's since been delayed and no doubt expanded a great deal, likely borrowing inspiration from the likes of Escape from Tarkov or Call of Duty's DMZ mode to help drive engagement via a more modernized live service model. Though, even the status of this project has been left in question, as Naughty Dog has only just recently admitted that the project has had its scope reduced significantly, in order to allow for a bulk of the creative team to focus on the studio's next major project instead. As for their next big single-player experience, it's even more unclear what is planned at the studio. According to Neil Druckmann, a Part 3 to The Last of Us is not currently in the works, as they feel the ending to Part 2 to be definitive, finalizing the stories of both Joel and Ellie in a way that really doesn't need any further exposition. Though a third game isn't necessarily off the table either, and considering the success of the television show, and the confirmation that HBO plans to continue the show into additional seasons, there's reason to believe a new video game may materialize in the coming years, as this would help capitalize on interest following the show's third season. However, Naughty Dog has also been hinting at a completely new property altogether, with some artwork found in their more recent games suggesting either a fantasy or a science fiction setting. This, coupled with the admission that in the past the studio has suffered from too much crunch and uneven management, suggests Naughty Dog will handle things much differently moving forward, and we'll just have to wait and see what they have planned for us in the future. Either way, the Last of Us series as it stands now is an incredible achievement in the video game medium, taking decades of technical and design innovation, and combining that with the higher tier quality of storytelling typically reserved for traditionally more respected mediums like film and literature. The Last of Us on the surface really does just seem like yet another zombie apocalypse story. But the beauty of it is that the infected creatures, cannibals, and zealous cults aren't necessarily the crux of the plot. The Last of Us, at its core, is a journey with these characters, Joel and Ellie, as they seek redemption, vengeance, and collective meaning to their lives. It's a bold step for both Naughty Dog and the medium, and even 10 years later, remains one of the most emotionally impactful video games that I've ever played. But what do you guys think? Which Last of Us game was your favorite? And where do you think Naughty Dog should go next? Let me know in the comments section. Also, I'd like to thank everyone who subscribed to my Patreon over the past few months for helping support this project. If you'd like to contribute to my future documentaries, and gain early access to any new content posted in the future, please consider becoming a member of my Patreon. You can find a link to the page in the description below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe here for all the latest coverage for new games, along with more ambitious documentaries I have planned in the future.